This week I'm going to go back to something a bit more savory rather than just desserts. This is going to be on making chicken pockets or chicken pillows, specifically chicken bacon pockets. It is a chicken and cheese mixture baked inside of a soft roll. So for this, to start this, we're going to start on the stove behind me. Now here on the stove, we just need a small saucepan enough to hold the chicken. So I'm going to actually cook the chicken in chicken stock. You can get already cooked chicken or shredded chicken. You need shredded chicken for this, so I'm just going to cook the chicken breasts and shred it myself. So I'm going to use one whole 32-ounce chicken stock. This should give me enough liquid to cover them entirely. So for this, I want the stock to just be able to cover it exactly, and we'll get it up to temperature, start boiling, and then turn it down to a simmer for about 30 minutes, and then check them, see how cooked they are. After about 30 minutes, should be pretty cooked through. You can pull one out and kind of pull it open and see if it's cooked through. You want to make sure the chicken's fully cooked, pull it out, and set the stock or broth, whichever you're using, aside. You won't need that for a little bit, and then take the chicken over and shred it. Now you can let the chicken cool down before you shred it. It won't affect it that much. But if you're working with it hot, just keep in mind that it will be hot. You usually I just use 2 forks for this. You're just using one to hold the chicken in place, the other to kind of pull at the chicken. You want to pull against the natural grain of the meat. So you'll see with the meat, there's natural kind of striations of the chicken protein. So when you're pulling against the grain, it's normally the length of the chicken breast that you're going to be kind of scraping against to get it separated. Now the upside to doing this yourself is that having cooked the chicken breast in the chicken stock, the benefit is that cooking the chicken breast in the chicken stock will help make the gravy that we're going to make later a little bit more robust, because you started with chicken stock and you cooked chicken in it. Yeah, that should be good. And what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to mix it with a KitchenAid. You can combine this by hand. I find it gives better consistency to have a little bit of motor power behind it. So I'm using this paddle attachment to mix it. And what I'll do is I'm going to add in all the chicken. Now I'll keep this bowl because I'm going to, once I get it mixed, I'm going to put it back in the bowl and put it in the fridge. So to go in the chicken, we're looking for a tablespoon of dried onions. And then for this recipe I'm putting some bacon in. You can cook and cut up the bacon. I prefer to make it, if you want to make it a little faster, you just go get kind of pre-cooked crumbled bacon. I'm going to put two tablespoons of that in the mixture. You can put more if you want it to be more bacon flavored. Otherwise, the other main flavoring is the onions that we're putting in. To go in this as well, I'm going to put some green onions in addition to the dried onions. So you're just going to cut these up finely. And there's my knife. So you can take off the ends and just get a nice fine mince going with this. Now, because this is going to be inside dough, it's not as important to get it uniform because you won't see much of it, and it's okay to have like some wilted parts that are cut up for the recipe. If you were doing this for like a display, you'd want the onions to be more, the more fresh they are, and therefore the more firm they are, the better they'll look. For this will do for what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm using 4 green onions for this. And that'll do. And then we're going to just mix this up. That's pretty good for now. So the last part of this filling is going to be cream cheese. You can use other cheeses. You just want to make sure as you're mixing it into the mixture that the chicken is cooled down a little bit. So if you're using like a shredded cheese, you don't melt the cheese in the mixture. I'm using 8 ounces. I'm using Nonfat, just because it's a little bit less fat, but gives you the same consistency, and so I prefer that in this recipe. Put 8 ounces in, and then on a low speed, we'll let it mix in. Once it starts to mix in, you can turn the speed up. This will actually, the higher speed will actually help further break down the chicken that you've shredded so that it will not be in chunks, but it actually be incorporated into the mixture. Okay, that's the consistency we're looking for. Now you can use the fork that you already used earlier with the chicken just to get it off the mixer. And we're going to put this in the fridge. We want this to be nice and solid when we're working it because it'll be easier to get it in the dough. Take this mixer off. And a spatula, because I'm actually going to take this and put it back in the original bowl because I'm going to use this mixer to also make the dough. Now, this is a pretty good consistency even just for like sandwiches if you need a shredded chicken filling for that. And if you're using it for that, you want to not refrigerate it because it'll be easier to work in like a sandwich form against a already cooked bread while it's warm. So while we're waiting for the mixture to thicken and solidify in the fridge essentially. We're going to make the soft rolls that we're going to wrap around these. So this recipe calls for fresh yeast, but typically most people don't have fresh yeast, they usually have active dry yeast. So if you have active dry yeast and you have a recipe that calls for fresh yeast, a good rule of thumb is to take the measurement and multiply it by 0.4. So for this recipe it calls for 0.75 ounces of fresh yeast. If we multiply it by 0.4 we get 0.3 ounces of active dry yeast. So we'll get the 12 ounces of water first. And you want the water to be warm water. It's because warmer water, the yeast will actually begin to activate. So I'm looking for 12 ounces of water. About there. And then 0.3 ounces of active dry yeast. Now because I'm doing by weight, I'm just going to sprinkle it in until I get to 0.3. There we go. That is good for the yeast. Now at this point you can let the yeast just sit in the water. What I like to do, especially if a recipe has any amount of sugar in it, I like to add that on top of the yeast just to give it something to eat. It makes it go a little, it makes it activate a bit faster. So this recipe has us do 2 ounces of sugar. Zero out the scale. And I'm just sprinkling it over top of the yeast. What this will also do is any of the dry yeast that hasn't soaked in at the top, as the weight of the sugar becomes more than the yeast can handle, it will actually pull the yeast down to the bottom of the water. So that's good enough. Now you want to let the yeast go for a bit, so as it soaks in the water and interacts with the sugar, it's going to start activating. You'll see little bubbles kind of come up to the surface, and we're going to actually let it go to that point, see if I can get it to show on camera pretty well. So at this point you can see little bits starting to come back up to the surface. That's due to the yeast emitting some gas. It's causing the yeast that has soaked to kind of begin to float to the surface and create a film on top. At that point, that's when you know you're good to start mixing in the rest of your flour and other dry ingredients. Just make sure that you don't mix the salt directly into the yeast. Direct exposure to the salt will kill off some of the yeast, and that will make your bread not rise as quickly. So we'll tear this and set it to 0. Now at this point, in order to give a buffer for the salt, I'm going to add the flour in first. So for this it is 21 ounces of flour. Now I find that even with the measurements, as I go, I'll need to add a little bit of flour into the mixer just to have it kind of set up properly. So I'm going to leave the flour out. Now for this we also want another 2 teaspoons or 0.4 ounces of salt can be added at this point because we've got the flour in here. to separate it from the yeast. Okay, there we go. We now need an ounce of non-fat milk solids. So for that, usually what I'll do is I'll go get kind of powdered buttermilk at the store, usually in the baking aisle, and that way I can get some of the same effect. So we need an ounce of that. It's not a lot, so just help add some delicateness to the final product. And this calls for an ounce of shortening and an ounce of butter, but I typically will just do a full 2 ounces of butter. It's just easier to do. I don't have to have shortening on hand for it. So 2 ounces of butter is about half of a stick. You have them in 4-ounce sticks. So I'm just going to slice it up. Now I'm not cubing it, I'm cutting it thin as I go. That's because I want to be able to use the mixer to blend it in. It's easier to get it to blend into the dough if it can break down into smaller chunks. But I'm not going to overdo it because the mixer will do most of the heavy lifting for me. Should be good for that. And then we're going to attach it to the mixer. Start it up. Now for this, I'm going to use the dough attachment. That's what this is if you have never used it before. And this will need to start on a really low setting because of all the flour we have in here. You can probably see it starting to come together into a dough. At that point you can go from the first stir speed to the speed 2, which will do more of a mix. And keep an eye out for what might be sticking around the bowl. You have a spatula handy in case you need to scrape it down to get it into one dough, but it should be good. So this will go, we'll run this for 10 to 12 minutes at the second speed. That will help incorporate the butter, build the gluten. What you're looking for is as it is now, it's pulling away from the edge. It's not sticking. If you touch it, it's not tacky. If you notice that it is sticking a little bit, dust a little bit of flour in, it'll incorporate in the outside and help it pull away. But we'll let this go for 10 minutes and then come back to it. So we've let it go long enough. As you pull it up, you'll see typically gravity is already starting to pull it off of the hook. You can just gently push it off. Take this off. So you got a nice smooth dough. There it goes. Had some moisture down there, which helped create a seal. So at this point we need to let it rise. Before we work it, you can see it's down here in the bowl. And I'll usually just grab some saran wrap, plastic wrap, get a square that'll fit, and then place it right on top. And I put it down so that it's right against the surface so you don't get a drying out of the dough. And normally you'd have this rise or ferment at 80 degrees. If you don't have a proofer or something, what I'll usually do is I just stick it, as I'm warming up the oven, to 400 degrees. To bake these, I will stick this on the oven. It's going to be nice and warm there on top as the on the stovetop as the oven's heating up. And we'll come back to that in an hour and a half. So the dough will have doubled in size, but it should still be not tacky. We're going to put a little flour on the counter. It's easier to work. And then remove the dough. Usually the bottom part of the dough will be a little bit more moist. I will just flour it a little bit so I can get it worked. And what I do for this is I just work it into a log because I'll cut off pieces of this to make the rolls. So this is a pretty good log. If you can, for me, if I can get my hand fully around it, that's a good thickness. Retrieve the filling that we're going to put in it. I don't have an exact measurements for getting the filling out. I find that using a spoon is pretty effective, getting enough. So here I'm looking for about like an inch and a half. It depends on how thick you want the bread around would be filling. So two ways to do it. The first is to just kind of spin around in your hands till you get a ball, and then press out the ball so as to make a pocket in the center. I will get a decent scoop, a spoonful of this. It's alright if you end up with filling left over. You can put it in the gravy. So once you have it like this as like a little pocket, you're just going to kind of pull the dough together in two directions. And then what I typically do is I'll just start pinching between my thumb and my pointer finger as I spin it in a circle with the other hand. That'll let me slowly work the end of the dough together so that I get a seal, and then spin in my hand once more and put it on the baking sheet. So you get a feel for how much of this you need. The second way to do this is, after having cut it off the main piece, you can just from here push it out to make a pocket instead of rolling it into a ball. Either way will work, and they work about the same. A possible benefit to doing it this way is that you have kind of the raw edge that's a little bit more moist than the floured edges, but they both seem to incorporate pretty consistently either way. So you're just going to work these until you run out of dough. So what I found is that this dough recipe makes a good amount. I think it made about 15 last time that I made them. We'll see how many it makes this time. But once you run out of dough, you just kind of stop, and then whatever you have left. But the filling you can either save for sandwiches, or you can mix into the gravy. I prefer to mix it in the gravy. It helps add some seasoning to that. See with how much I'm using if I end up with extra. If you do have some filling sticking through the bottom, like some pieces of chicken, Try to pull some dough over top of it so you can get it like seal and you don't end up with a hole where it can leak out. Once you've got them all rolled out, you just want to melt some butter, about 2 tablespoons, brush them with butter, and then dip them in some Italian seasoned breadcrumbs. So these are just breadcrumbs that are seasoned with parsley, oregano, basil, and thyme. If you don't have breadcrumbs access to it, but you have the spices, you can mix those and sprinkle the herbs over top. And then once you have that set to go, you put it in the oven at 400 degrees for 30 minutes and check it. As you get close to the 30-minute mark, you're going to want to check and see if they're beginning to brown. As they begin to brown, that's when you're going to want to pull them out. Since the chicken's already cooked, everything in it's good to go, we're just needing to cook the actual roll and have the center be heated up. So over here, while we are letting the rolls bake, we're going to make the gravy. So this gravy gets put over top these rolls, or you can eat them plain. I do like to make them with the gravy. It adds a bit to the dish. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this extra filling that was part of what was left over. I'm actually going to mix this into the stock that we have. So what this will do is we'll add some richness to the gravy. It's going to give us chicken in the gravy. It's going to give us the onions, the green onions in the gravy, and the cream cheese will add a nice texture as we go. So I'm just going to incorporate this, let it dissolve the cheese that was holding it together. I'm going to find a whisk. Then we're going to have to thicken this. So the stuff we're adding, this will not thicken it, it's just going to help season it. But what we're going to do is make a roux to thicken this. So I'm going to swap burners just so that I have a little bit more to work with here. So thickening our gravy with a roux versus thickening it with cornstarch and water. There are two different processes. What I find is that thickening with a roux, the end product is more, it doesn't congeal as much. So if you ever thickened anything with cornstarch, if you have to refrigerate part of it, you'll notice that the refrigerated gravy will end up in like a solid mass, and you'll have to like uncongeal it or reconstitute it when you go to use it later. What I do here is 3 tablespoons of butter, and we'll get that melted down. And once we get that melted down, we'll add some flour to it. Now be mindful, if you have a ceramic pan or a pan that can resist metal, then it's good to whisk straight in it. If you just have a coated pan, like Teflon coated or something, they're not always able to resist the metal interaction, and so you may scratch them. So I'm going to add half a cup of flour to this butter, mixed up. Now it's going to make a paste. The paste will start to smell like cookies at one point because it is flour and butter. So I ended up adding a little bit more flour than I intended, so I can just add a little bit more butter. And melt that in. I'll add another tablespoon to this. So right now I have it on medium heat just to get everything incorporated. You want to cook this for a bit. It heats up the flour, kind of cooks away some of the raw flour taste. Now if you were to add the flour directly in like a slurry to the gravy, you could get a bit of a raw flour taste to it, which isn't the most appealing. So you could probably add more butter to this, but I've gotten it to a point where it's working into like a bit of a paste here. It looks like crumbs, but it will dissolve pretty well. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is move this to the burner that I'm using. And I'm going to incorporate the roux into the mixture. So I will typically just, get some in and then immediately whisk it. What you want to avoid is you want it to incorporate before the liquid for the gravy is fully heated, because if you got the roux straight in, it might begin to thicken in chunks. So now as I'm mixing this, I only have like chicken bits that are the chunks. It's fully mixed in that roux. And as this heats up to a boil, it will begin to thicken, at which point I can pull it off the heat. Now once the roux is incorporated, you can switch to just a wooden spoon, so that you don't have to keep tapping all the chicken out of the whisk. But you do want to stir this pretty regularly. You don't want the film to form on the bottom as the bottom thickens due to the heat, and the top not to have thickened. Yeah, that's how you can burn a gravy. So we're starting to get some thickening already. Now it is already thickened, but I do want to get it to a boil before I pull it off, just to make sure it's thickened as much as it's going to. Okay, I've gotten some bubbles, and that seems to be pretty good. So we'll just pull that off. And this will be for pouring over them once they're out of the oven. Alright, at 30 minutes, it rolls out. This did pretty well. You can see nice browning on them. I'm going to take one. The rest over here. So now, once you have them, you let them rest a little bit, they'll be really hot. But with the gravy, you have two things you can do. One is you can just put the gravy on top, but then you lose the kind of the crispiness of the breadcrumbs that you did. So one thing that I like to do is you can take the gravy and just like put it on the side. As you eat the bread, you can just use a fork to push down and cut through it. You can mop up the gravy as you eat it, and there you have it.